Hi, I'm Carolyn Kellogg with the Los Angeles Times, and I'm here with Tayari Jones, the novelist and professor of creative writing at Rutgers Newark, to talk about Maya Angelou, who we lost today. Hi, Tayari.
Hi, Carolyn.
So tell me a little bit about Maya Angelou's legacy. She was writing poetry for almost half a century.
Well, she did write poetry for half a century, but that is actually a small part of her legacy. She actually kind of burst onto the literary scene in 1969 when she published her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, that, has sold millions of copies and, is still read to this day. When I teach my literature classes at Rutgers, that is very often the one book all the students have read already. And in this memoir, which was published, like I said, in 1969, which was the year before I was born, in many ways, it was kind of like the woman's response or the woman's answer to Richard Wright's memoir, Black Boy. Black Boy was published around 1945, and it was his memoir of growing up in the Jim Crow South. And so with Caged Bird, Angelou also wrote about her experience, but it was a very different experience. It was a woman's experience, and she spoke about being raped as a child by a family member. And nowadays, there's a lot of conversation about rape, a number of rape memoirs, we can count them off. But when she did that, it truly was a taboo, and she kind of kicked open that door for women to tell their stories. And it's particularly poignant in the context of African American women, because keep in mind that when Angelou was coming up, the question of rape was really about, the Southern scourge of black men being accused of rape. And so she wrote about being raped, within her own community by a family member, which took incredible bravery. But if you notice that she was not kind of demonized like, say, Alice Walker was in the 1980s when she wrote The Color Purple. And I think it was because you could tell on every page all the love Maya Angelou had for her community. And so that was really how she became known as a writer. And she wrote, I think, 5 volumes of memoir. I remember as a child seeing them stacked up. They had, I guess what we call now franchise covers, but I remember them stacked up on my mother's dresser. I mean, this was something that everyone was reading throughout the late 1970s, the 80s. She was candidly telling a story that had not been told. And then, of course, there is the poetry, which are perennial favorites, Phenomenal Woman, Still I Rise. And then there's her career as an actress, her career as a dancer, as a singer. She really was a woman, I won't say who had it all, because I don't think she considered her accomplishments as having. I think she considered as doing, as service. So I'm going to say that she was a woman who did it all.
I know that she became friends with Oprah. Do you think that shared history, or just her talents as a writer, or her position as a role model were what connected her to people like Oprah, who also went on to succeed in all these huge ways?
Well, I think she was friends with people like Oprah, but I think she was also friends with everyday people. Sometimes I would be at a book event and I would meet someone in the audience and I would say that I'm a writer, and they would say, do you know Dr. Angelou? And I would say, well, I've met her once or twice, but I don't really know her. And this person, who's just an everyday person, would say, oh, I know her. She had come to my house. So I think that she had something that connected with people across a lot of lines. I think her friendship with Oprah, it's famous, it's well known. They're both, very high profile, and it's fun to fantasize about the secret conversations between high-profile people. But I think the important thing about Dr. Angelou is that it seemed like she just had a connection, a vibe with people.
Tell me a little bit about what her charisma was like in person. You've seen her read, right? You saw her read?
I've seen her read, and I was even once or twice in like a green room. And of course, I didn't want to bother her. I felt like I was just a little, she's Dr. Maya Angelou. Yes, I've written a couple books, but she's Dr. Maya Angelou. So I kind of would sit there and watch and listen. Her charisma, incredible. First off, she just cuts such an imposing figure. I mean, she's very tall, probably nearly 6 feet tall, because she's taller than me, and always exquisitely dressed. She had this kind of booming voice, and she just made you feel happy to be who you were. Like, she didn't make you say, oh, I want to be like her. She was such an individual, and she just wore that so fiercely that you thought, well, perhaps I too could wear my own skin as fiercely. It's like she made you feel better about yourself. And you know what she said, her famous quote, people won't remember what you said, they'll remember how you made them feel. And that's what I remember about how I felt. I felt like I mattered.
One of our commenters on our website said that she was a great and generous human who gave others reason to hope. How do you think she keyed into that sense of hope? Not just feeling good about yourself, but feeling possibility and openness to achievement.
Well, I think part of it was her example, just her fine example of having been born in Stamps, Arkansas, in the height of Jim Crow, and going on to be the inaugural poet. And the way that she spoke about herself, she didn't make herself seem like some grand exception. She made you feel like it could happen to you too. And I think that's a very important thing. And also, you know, as Americans, we are very much enamored of the narrative of reinvention. But I think Angelou really gave us an example of consistency, what it is to be true to yourself. Yes, change as you change, but not like a gimmick or like, now I'm this thing or that thing. She was herself all those years, and she shared that quite openly with readers. And I think it was just very empowering and made us, like I said before, love our imperfect selves. And she wrote very candidly about the challenges she faced throughout her life, challenges, like I say, growing up in the Jim Crow South, challenges of being a mother, trying to become an artist. And like she says, and still I rise, still she rose. And you think, yeah, maybe I'll rise.
I know that was the title of a Tupac record. You talked about how she was a role model for African American women, but Tupac, Dave Chappelle have cited her as being an important role model. What example do you think she set for African American men?
I think she kind of set for them the feeling that you are loved, you are worthy. I mean, so much of her writing was couched in this deep affection for men. She was a deeply devoted mother to a son. And I think just being loved in public it's just inspirational. And I think she's a true patron of the arts, both kind of what you would think of lofty high arts, but I think she enjoyed popular music, popular movies. I think she was in a movie. Wasn't she in one of Tyler Perry's movies? I mean, I think that she was kind of a Prometheus figure in some ways, that she stole the fire and shared it with all of us.
I learned today, when we learned that she passed away today, she was 86. She lived this huge and long life. And I learned today that she spent 4 years in the early 60s in Africa. Do you know anything about that period of her life?
Yes, I believe that's the one covered in her memoir. I think it's the one, Gathered Together in My Name. A lot of African Americans went to West Africa during the 1960s. And if I recall correctly, she was there. Yes, she was there on the day that W.E.B. Du Bois died, which was also the day of the March on Washington. She writes about her experiences there. And really, one thing I love about her is that she wrote about them, in definitely a symbolic way, in this idea of return to the homeland. But then there are also such funny stories about the people she met and the way that she really integrated herself into the community there. And I could totally relate, because in the 1980s, my own parents did something similar and packed up the kids, packed up the house, and we moved to Nigeria kind of in search of this African-American reconnection with the homeland. And I felt like she completely encountered both the hopefulness of that move and also just the impossibility of it, but also the feeling, once you've done it, that you are so glad you did and you would never hope to undo it, that you really did go home, even though it's not exactly your home. I feel like she got all of that complexity without ever lapsing into sentimentality. Just perfect, pitch perfect.
You know, it's interesting. That reminds me that I think she appeared in Roots, the 70s television series. And she began her career so long ago. Like in the 60s, she was important in the 70s, she was important in the 80s. How do you think her writing has endured, and do you think it will continue to speak to young people today?
Oh, I think it will continue to endure, and I think the reason, it's so funny, I was just having a conversation trying to say why is it, for example, that her work is still read popularly as opposed to, say, I was comparing her to Richard Wright because of the obvious connection between Black Boy, and I think it's because her writing, her prose has such textures. There's pain, but there's also such joy. Also, there's both. So she offers you an entire life in a book. She offers you an entire world in a poem, and that is what I think allows it to endure. And it's very accessible. When she was honored by the National Book Foundation, she said words to the effect of, "It's very hard to write poetry that's easy to read," but that she wrote poetry that you can read by yourself. You don't need the assistance of a teacher, but if you have a professor, you can read more into it. I mean, my students can quote it. My students, who some of them freshmen who say this is their first literature class, they have read Maya Angelou's poetry on their own because it speaks to them. And I think it will continue to speak, you know, as long as we all have this common thing as known as the human heart. I believe her work will continue to endure.
So do you think it connects to the heart as well as the intellect? Does it have a place in sort of the intellectual canon of academia?
Oh, absolutely, because I mean, I think the thing about the intellectual canon of academia, I mean, work like Maya Angelou's that can be read on multiple levels. You know, I was tracing the influence of her work on many other poets in my African American class this semester. It can be, in my students, they pop and say, "Oh, professor, I think you're reading too much into it." You know how they do. But the thing is that it's all in there. The allusion to myth, the different poetic forms, the kind of use of dialect that, you know, speaks back to Dunbar, to Hughes, the obvious influence of Zora Neale Hurston, all that, even Dos Passos, all that is in her work if you care to look for it. But what makes something endure is how much it connects with one individual sitting in a chair reading a book. That's the book you read over again. That's the book as a student you do not sell back to the bookstore because you want to keep it. And that's what makes something endure.
Do you think that the other aspects of her life, such as she danced with Alvin Ailey, she performed in Porgy and Bess in Europe, I think she recorded at least one record. Do you think that those other aspects fed the written word that ended up on the page, that thing that can be passed down?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you have to have something to write about, and Dr. Angelou was a true citizen of the world. She traveled all over while remaining herself, and that is the thing that makes the work so rich and complex and little secrets hiding around the corner, because she lived a full life, full of adventure, and more importantly, full of wonder. I do believe that for her, having grown up in the time when she did, when her home, when, you know, the United States as her home was not always welcoming, it sent her out into the world, not necessarily as an exile. I don't think she felt like she was in exile the way maybe Baldwin did, but I think she felt wonder. I think it sent her away from her home feeling like she loved home and many things about it, but perhaps there was another way to live. So she was always a traveler, never a tourist. And I believe this is what fed the work.
I know that she published a book in 2013, again, looking back at her relationship with her mother. What kind of challenges do you think there are for a writer who's been writing memoir for decades to bring something new and something fresh and to keep pushing oneself to keep writing like that?
Well, one thing, you know, she had been writing memoir for decades, so like anything else, she had gotten really good at it, one. And secondly, at her age, she just had the incredible hindsight of years. You know, I mean, there are a lot of memoirs people write now very young, like What Happened to Me Last Week, or something like that. But she can look back as a woman in her 80s on her relationship with her mother and think of all the changes she's seen in the world. There are very few people who can remember a time growing up. I mean, there's this really heart-wrenching scene in Cagebird, where they bury her, they hide, I won't say bury, but they hide her uncle underneath bushels of potatoes because they're fearful there will be a lynching that night and they want to hide him. And her Uncle Willie is so humiliated because, you know, he had a disability, and so the women were hiding him under all these potatoes until the danger had passed. So to have gone from witnessing that to speaking at Bill Clinton's inauguration, to be given the Presidential Medal a few years ago, I mean, I don't think she had any trouble finding something unprecedented to write about, because this has never happened to anyone.
Do you think that, what do you think drove her to continue writing? Like, why not just sit back and accept the awards and be invited to speak? Why did she keep going back to the page?
Because the page is where she lives. No matter where she was all over the world, different times of her life, it was always the thing that she did. I mean, I would be more perplexed if she didn't keep writing. I mean, awards are awesome, but they're not where you live. Awards are just something that happened to you. The writing, that's who she was.
For people who are just coming to learn of her now, because poets don't and writers don't maintain such a central role in our culture, sadly, where would you, I know that she's just been so beloved, where would you suggest somebody coming new to her start in terms of reading her books? Should they start with a memoir? Should they start?
They start from the beginning and just walk yourself through.
Tayari Jones, thank you very much. You joined us here today to talk about Maya Angelou. Thank you, Tayari.
Thanks for the invitation. I had a great time.
Okay, this has been Carolyn Kellogg with the Los Angeles Times talking about Maya Angelou with Tayari Jones. Thank you.